Lord of Mysteries Fire of Destruction Chapter 442. The next day. Artelia District. Warehouse. Adrian counted the minutes until everyone arrived to their special place in the warehouse. His companion sat a few meters away, calmly reading a book. Her gaze focused on the pages that passed by at a steady pace. He only had a cup of coffee in his left hand, while in his right hand, a few small fireballs danced calmly. The sound of heavy footsteps reached his ears, along with the sensation of his threads breaking. Clenching his fist and extinguishing the fireballs, he drank what was left of his coffee and placed the cup in a safe place where it would not break. The door to the room was opened with a loud bang. And a massive woman with green eyes entered. As soon as her eyes fell on him, a big toothy smile formed on her face. Boss. Accustomed to this, Adrian didn't even fight it. He just got up from his seat and relaxed his body. The next moment, the woman's huge arms had him in a spine-crushing embrace. Patting the woman's back in appreciation, he laughed a little at the situation. I missed you too, Sasha. How have you been? Ashera isn't as much fun as Backland, but at least I don't have to worry about a surprise attack. Laughing a little, the big woman lowered her boss. Pugilist Shasha hadn't changed much. Her hair was still that orangey blonde and her bright green eyes were as bright as ever. Her new name in Lindbergh was Frida Curie. A name of which the woman was very proud. Taking the name of one of the most outstanding female soldiers in the history of the Fainapater Kindong during the Battle of the Violated Oath. Sasha hoped that taking such a woman as inspiration would help her to digest her potion better. She hadn't done much in the weeks she had been in Ashera. Her job was relatively normal, a librarian. This job gave her free time to perform in the odd bar in the more remote villages in the Oldia district. And it seemed to be working. She was a little taller than the last time Adrian saw her. Looking at the woman's side, at the little girl, Adrian smiled a little and ruffled the curly brown hair with his left hand. And how have you been? How about your new powers? Gray eyes looked back at him, a small smile on the girl's freckled face. They're not as incredible as I thought. But being able to analyze people so easily has its advantages. Who suspects that they are being scrutinized by a child? Jerry's appearance had not changed at all. As an East Borough child, her documents were not the best, more of a formality than a true birth record. Add to that the fact that no one was left to look for her if she disappeared. In the eyes of the world, Jerry Katniss no longer existed. Her new identity as Tammy Mouse was more real than the previous one. To keep her education up to date, she was now studying at a school in the Helicon district. A courtesy of the Church of the God of Knowledge and Wisdom that would not allow a single child to be uneducated. Giving her head a final pat, Adrian placed a hand on his waist and asked. In your classes, how is your language study going? History. You're not having any problems, are you? The smile on the young girl's face broke and she just growled in frustration. Do I really have to attend? I'm already a Beander. Why do I have to participate in boring classes? Adrian's smile faded with a sigh. Before the girl could react, he grabbed her cheek with 2 fingers and squeezed with a little force, twisting as he squeezed. Grandma's technique. Ow. Slamming his hand down, Jerry pouted at him. Don't mess with your teachers. Adrian reprimanded with a gentle but stern voice. Just because you're a Beander doesn't make you more than a normal person. In many ways, they are much more blessed than us. Puffing out her cheeks, the girl rubbed her red cheek and lowered her head slightly. Yes, sir. Come on, boss. Don't be so hard on the little one. Classes are boring. Sasha leapt to the child's defense, her back straight and proud. Adrian stared at the giant without expression. Slowly, his left hand rose towards her cheek. The giant's confidence and righteousness immediately broke. But knowing that she could not abandon her younger companion, she turned around, quickly grabbed the girl, and placed her on her shoulder. Run. Put me down, Miss Sasha. Quote. Flora watched everything with a slight twitch of eyebrow. I'm not even going to say anything anymore. Adrian nodded in agreement. There were times when he didn't quite understand the giant himself. A while later and after promising not to use that move on her, Sasha and Jerry calmed down. The blonde looked at Flora curiously. So you're one of the new team members, huh? Pausing for a few seconds, Sasha smiled broadly. Nice to meet you. I'm Sasha Strauss. A sequence 8 pugilist. I hope we get along. She finished saying, extending her hand towards her. Flora looked at the giant for about 7 seconds in silence, finally extended her hand and responded to the handshake. Quote. Flora Jacob. Prometheus of Sequence 6. Sequence 6. Somewhat surprised, Sasha looked at her in amazement. You seem only a little older than me and already such a high sequence. You have my respect, Miss Flora. Peef. Ignoring the beating of her brow and refusing to look at the redhead, Flora just nodded to the giant. Thank you, Miss Sasha. But I'm sure it won't be long until you are Sequence 6 too. The smile on the giant's face shone even brighter. Ha! May the god of combat hear your words. Giving a little stronger squeeze at the end, Sasha finally let her go and it was now the turn of the youngest of the group. Little Jerry looked with her head slightly tilted at Flora, her crystalline eyes looking deeply at the woman. After a few seconds, Jerry blinked and came out of spectator state. Her gray eyes clashed with the gray of the white-haired woman. After a few seconds, she said, I've never met anyone with the same eye color as me. At her words, Flora smiled proudly. Bending down to the girl, she whispered in her ear, that's because only special people have them. Those born with gray eyes are destined to achieve great things. Jerry looked at her sideways without showing much reaction before the corners of her lips lifted. Then I have to try hard to make sense of them, don't I? Of course. Straightening up, Flora looked down at the girl. When have great things been achieved with mediocrity? Quote. Jerry fell back into silence again, but a smile adorned her lips. Closing her eyes, the little girl grasped the edges of her tunic and bowed slightly. Jerry Katniss. Spectator of Sequence 9. It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Flora. Oh. Letting the corners of her lips rise in satisfaction, Flora also grasped the edges of her tunic and bowed gently. A pleasure. After the greetings, Sasha turned to the redhead and said, Boss, you said you'd introduce us to another member. Where is he? Opera is bringing him. They shouldn't take long. Adrian said calmly as he began to move the chairs and tables aside. Sasha started to help him do that. Could you tell us what he's like? From what I understand, his mental state is a bit special. She knew that the new member was half monster and that led to certain mental problems. She had never come across anything like it in her life, so she didn't know what to expect. He's a young guy with black hair and eyes of the same color. When we found him, he was a bit skinny and tired, but I'm sure the treatment from opera helped him with that, Adrian replied calmly as he leaned the last chair against the wall. That's what he looks like. As for his personality, his tastes, or his fears, I'd be lying if I told you. The boy has been out of his mind all his life. I couldn't tell you if he even has a personality apart from the state brought on by being born half Beander. At the mention of halves, Jerry jumped at attention and walked over to his side. Is he like me? Yes and no. Compared to you, he's the short end of the stick. Adrian said honestly as he took some tools out of the boxes and placed them on one of the tables. In what sense? Jerry asked curiously. This time, Flora entered. He hears and sees things he shouldn't. His intuition is so high that it gives him horrible visions of the future and what may happen to him. It's not through sheer luck that he has reached adolescence. That kind of unfortunate people die from strange causes at a very early age. Is someone like that going to join us? Boss, is that a good idea? Sasha asked, watching as the man finished setting up the still. Once he is a complete monster, all his mental problems will disappear and his intuition will stabilize. Finishing preparing everything, he finally turned to look at them. Why do you think I called you here? Somewhat taken aback by the question, Sasha was about to answer immediately that it was for the introduction of new members when she stopped. If it was to introduce a new member, why were only they called? Shouldn't he have called the rest of the team? Also, why had he made so much room by moving the tables? Why did they need so much space if they were only going to introduce? Noticing this problem, she frowned and, after a few moments, replied. Is it to control the boy? That's right. Adrian nodded. Just because drinking the potion cures him of his madness doesn't mean there can't be accidents in the process. The chance that he'll lose control and turn into a monster isn't as low as I'd like, and since he'd be an out-of-control monster, it's best to deal with him in numbers. So that if luck causes one of us to fail to deal with it immediately, the other can deal with the results that may follow. Quote. Sasha looked at a silent Jerry who was looking at the floor before returning her attention to her boss. Is it a good idea to bring Jerry for this? She's just a child. A child who decided to enter the Beyonder world. The faster she desensitizes herself to this the better. Understood. Observing how gloomy she had become, Adrian sighed and approached Sasha. Raising a hand, he smacked her forehead with some force, bringing her out of her stupor. Don't be so pessimistic, Sasha. While the possibility of him losing control is high, I'm sure the boy will be fine. He's lucky. And with the pathway focusing on luck, that's cheating right from the start. Smiling amusedly, Adrian turned away. I'll explain things better once Opera and the boy arrive. Until then, relax a little. If the boss is so calm, it must be all right. Rubbing her forehead painfully, Sasha nodded, more relaxed, her worries much less. It wasn't long after that short explanation that Opera arrived. Taking Ademisol by the hand, he looked much healthier and cleaner. Sorry, I'm late. This guy here didn't want to eat his vegetables. The red-eyed woman laughed softly. Whistle. Good job, Opera. I almost didn't recognize him. Adrian looked the young man up and down, nodding in appreciation. The boy's pale cheeks had puffed up and taken on a healthy pink color. The dark circles under his eyes had disappeared and he walked with more energy. Although he was still muttering strange and unintelligible things, the Ademisol of now was much better than the one who had entered her flower shop 2 weeks ago. That is the mother's pathway for you. In a way, we humans are also plants that need care and nourishment to flourish. Finishing the analysis, the redhead smiled at the black-haired woman. I hope he didn't cause any problems. Laughing softly, she waved her hand in dismissal, not at all. He behaved very well with me and even helped me a little at the flower shop. Letting go of the young man's hand, Opera let him move around the room but never took her eyes off him. Of course, I had to stop him from biting a sunflower or two, but it only happened 3 times. He was such a sweetheart. I'm sure he thinks you're his mom. Flora joined the conversation as she watched the half-monster looking lost at Sasha, who started chatting to him. Excuse me. The boy's mental state is fluctuating, so his intuition acts more like his consciousness. It's likely that his intuition decided that you were safe, so the boy stayed calm. That explains a few things. Mumbling a little dazed, Opera looked at the boy and rethink every interaction she had with him. I didn't think he saw me like that. Once he becomes a monster, that might change. It's an influence of sensitive intuition without control. Once he can control it, that should change. A little absent, the woman nodded lost. The sudden class left her stunned. Recovering after a few seconds, Opera remembered what she had come for and looked somewhat embarrassed at the woman in front of her. She was supposed to introduce herself to the new member of the team and solve Ademisol's mental problem. It had slipped her mind. So, redeeming herself, the woman bowed slightly. Excuse me, miss. I haven't introduced myself yet. I'm Opera, the planter from Sequence 9. It's a pleasure to meet you. The white-haired woman stared at her and slightly nodded. Flora Jacob, Prometheus of Sequence 6. Current guard of that guy. She finished by pointing at the redhead who had taken Ademisol with him to the table he had prepared. Having been raised and grown up in East Barot, Opera could say that she could easily detect hostility in people's words. For that reason, she couldn't help but feel somewhat confused by the woman's last words. For a moment, it seemed that that instinct was triggered, but she didn't feel any hostility. Ignoring that, Opera smiled gently at Flora. I hope we get along. Ready to come to your senses? Adrian asked with a simple smile. Ademisol did not reply, he just stared at him with vacant eyes. The corners of Adrian's lips trembled slightly. Just wait a moment. Grabbing a briefcase that he had placed next to the table, Adrian opened it and began to take out all the ingredients to prepare the monster potion. He had already taken them out of the City of Calamities several hours ago so that they could breathe. With Ademisol's keen intuition, the redhead was sure that taking out the ingredients here would kill the boy, and if the ingredients were not cleansed of the aura of the Saphira, problems could arise. After thoroughly cleaning the pot and making sure that the boy would not try to eat the ingredients when he wasn't looking, Adrian began to prepare the potion. 5 acorns from the east, 4 grams of silver, 10 milliliters of methane. Calmly, the redhead reached out and, using his threads, cut some of Ademisol's hair and grabbed it. After counting 7, he threw the hair into the pot. Once that was done, he put on some gloves and picked up a metal vial. Adrian opened it and poured it into the pot. A shiny, heavy liquid with a silvery white metallic color fell from the vial. This was southern mercury, and all its contents fell into the pot, which was 100 grams. As soon as the shiny liquid touched all the other ingredients in the pot, they melted and fused into a blackish-gray liquid. Looking at the result, Adrian grabbed one of his container vests and opened it, using his threads to pull the last main ingredient out. Through his invisible threads, the entire head of a pink mamba was thrown into the pot. There was a swirl inside, and the snake's head soon melted. After a few seconds, the liquid in the pot changed from a dark gray to bright silver, looking like liquid mercury. The monster potion was ready. Pouring the entire contents into a cup, Adrian took out his mirror and, after a short divination, confirmed the potion's success. He turned to the boy. The glove in his left hand went from a simple black to an Alice blue that emitted an aura of tranquility. At the same time, he tapped his palm twice. Ademisol. Until I tell you, you will ignore every voice, sound, and whisper that is not my voice. You will ignore everything around you and focus on me and only me, nothing else. Also, you will follow my instructions until I snap my fingers. Is that clear? The redhead spoke in a soft, calm voice and examined the young man's aura. Blinking slightly, the young man's lost black eyes came into focus and centered on his face. The man's voice cleared the fog in his mind and once again, the whispers that had tortured him all his life seemed to fall silent. Enjoying this strange state for a few seconds, he nodded roughly. Yes, sir. Observing the boy's change, Adrian whispered wisely in his heart. Beware of the spectator. Without a doubt, in Ademisol's state of mind, if he drank the potion he would lose control because of the ravings he would hear and he would either become a monster or die. Luckily for the boy, Adrian had many ways of dealing with them, one of which was the glove in his left hand. This was one of the abilities of the 5 souls creeping hunger had grazed, the sequence 7 psychiatrist's psychological cue. This ability allowed him to cue a target through specific methods, words, and a medium, allowing them to abide by his arrangements without realizing it. Adrian did not use this ability because he already had it as a conspirator, being much more effective as it was not a power, making it difficult to detect. But, in cases like Ademisol's, it was much better to use the psychiatrist's power for that very reason. Being a conspirator, his voice met all the requirements to apply a cue without his target realizing it. For the duration of the boy's promotion, Adrian would implant cues so that nothing would interrupt or cause problems. The redhead nodded in satisfaction and, confirming that everything was ready, handed the potion to the young man. Drink this. Ignore the taste and drink it all. Don't drink it so quickly that you choke, just enough to finish it in a few sips. Ademisol nodded again. Without doubting his actions, he raised the vial to his mouth and did exactly what he was asked. In a few sips, the cup was emptied. Immediately, he experienced an intense headache and a strange shiver that felt like worms under his skin. Ignore those sensations. Focus on me and my voice. Adrian repeated, his voice never leaving the calmness of before. The panic that almost overwhelmed Ademisol calmed down almost entirely and he focused again on the man. Take deep, slow breaths. Close your eyes and empty your mind. Don't think about anything. Just focus on my voice and no other. Only on mine. Constantly applying cues to maintain Ademisol's state, they continued like this until the boy's aura finally stabilized. Now, it was a faint silvery white color. Moving within itself like a circular river. Nodding to this, Adrian turned off his spiritual vision and smiled at the young man whose eyes were closed. Raising his right hand, the redhead snapped his fingers. Snap. With the signal given, all the cues applied to Ademisol disappeared. And his eyes opened. His black eyes were no longer lost and did not seem to be seeing things that should not be seen. They had become much deeper and more focused. Blinking in surprise, Ademisual raised his hand and placed it on his ears, trying to hear something. Hello. Unsure, he said something and after confirming that he was not suddenly deaf, his eyebrows rose in shock. Tears began to fall from his eyes and a smile from ear to ear formed on his face. With extreme gratitude, the young man looked at everyone present and, in a choked voice, said, I can't hear them anymore. For as long as he could remember, the voices and visions that had tormented him all his life had finally fallen away. Smiling at the boy, Adrian tapped his head and ruffled his hair. Congratulations. You're a complete monster now. Wiping away tears with the sleeve of his robe, the young man nodded tremblingly and, without thinking, embraced the tall man in front of him with all his might. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Rolling his eyes but with a smile, Adrian returned the hug a little. There, it's okay. Extremely pleased with what she saw, Flora couldn't help but laugh a little and teased with a mischievous voice. Foo. What did I tell you, princess? You're quite a mom. Adrian just stared at the woman with a flat face. Seriously, now. Sasha, who had seen everything, couldn't help but exclaim tenderly. That everything had gone well and that the boy hadn't lost control relieved her of a weight she didn't want to bear. Sniff. Opera said nothing, she just wiped the tears from her eyes with a handkerchief. So that's one of the abilities I'll have later on. Jerry murmured in amazement at what she had seen. When she had advanced to spectator, Mr. Kenway had explained to her about her path and the abilities she would gain as she climbed the sequences. This was the first time she had seen one of them. That's one of the abilities of the Sequence 7 psychiatrist, isn't it? She hadn't been so concerned about what Mr. Kenway had said. She had complete faith that he would not let that happen, so she was curious about how he would do it. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. When Ademisol finally calmed down, the tables were rearranged so that now everyone was seated. Well, with the most annoying problem solved, we can now sit down and deal with others, Adrian said. It won't be much trouble for the boy to continue staying with you for the time being, will it, Opera? Not at all. Opera smiled as she ate one of the oatmeal cookies she had brought. The help in the shop is appreciated. She had already become fond of the boy during that time, and as he never caused any problems, the planter saw this as an easy job. Nodding to the planter, he turned his attention to the boy in question. Any complaints? Monster Ademisol nodded slowly. It doesn't bother me. I like being with Madame Opera, he whispered, then fell back into silence. He would take a long time to get used to having a silent mind. Not finishing his questioning of the boy, Adrian continued, once you consumed the potion, did you feel something strange when I snapped my fingers? Ademisol took a few seconds, but after thinking about it for a while, he nodded, as if something inside me had finally broken. I don't know what it was, but it felt really good. That was the digestion of your potion, boy. Smiling and ignoring the tug at his soul, Adrian added quickly. We'll explain it better in a moment, but now we have some things to discuss. Do you remember what you said when I asked you why you went into my basement and looked for me? About the witches. Witches. The demoness sect. Sasha's eyebrows rose in bewilderment, and she unconsciously clenched her fists tightly. She paid much more attention to what was being discussed. Some bits. I wasn't paying much attention to my surroundings. Ademisol admitted honestly. The constant onslaught of murmurs and visions made reality very difficult to discern and separate, blurring many memories. Nodding slightly, Adrian was not bothered by this, he had expected it. Repeat what you remember. Don't leave out any details, no matter how useless or meaningless it may be. I'll do my best. Ademisol closed his eyes and, concentrating on that day, repeated what little he could remember. The visions began when I was at my usual stall in a market. I don't remember what I was doing, but I do remember what I saw. The young man trembled visibly and paused. Opera, who was sitting next to him, gently caressed his arm. With a sweet smile, she said, it's okay. Take your time. Nodding, still a little tense but visibly calmer, he continued. It was during the afternoon, I think. I was in my usual place in the Tingen market when everything in front of me went dark. Suddenly, I found myself walking through the streets of a strange city I didn't know. People in thick coats were passing me, snow was falling, and children were playing with it. Everyone was laughing when, suddenly, the sky lit up orange. From the sky, a rain of fire-covered mountains descended into the distance and was lost behind the hills. I saw a massive explosion on the horizon. Immediately afterwards, an enormous wind whipped up and blew me away. The view changed, and I could see only rubble, the remains of a city at my feet, along with mountains of corpses. The explosion burned some, others had their necks bulging and foam coming out of their mouths. On the horizon, a huge mushroom cloud was rising. A woman's laughter completely drowned out the survivors' cries of agony. No, it wasn't laughter, it was a cackle. In the face of the city's destruction, a woman was cackling. And she wasn't the only one. I heard many women laughing out loud. Ademisal paused and swallowed, then continued, they looked like witches from a nightmare, bathing in the blood and despair of the people left behind by the disaster. It was then that the vision changed from disaster to nothingness, a black void that swallowed everything. The murmurs and voices that had been shouting at me at all hours of the day repeated a single phrase. Find the void. You'll be safe there. Adrian, who had said nothing, stared at Ademisal, digesting everything the boy had said. After a moment, he asked, are you sure it wasn't Tingen the city you saw? I'm sure. I'd never seen clothes like the ones people were wearing. Is there any detail about their clothing apart from their coats? Something that stood out, like an earring or some special or curious accessory? Ademisal frowned but, after a while, nodded with his eyes open. Yes. Now that I think about it, they did have something like that. He then pointed to everyone present, his eyes lit up. The few I could recognize had those same accessories on their arms and heads that you guys wear. The emotion with which he had spoken faded as the realization of what it meant sank in. Adrian put a hand to his forehead, and his headache increased severely. It can never be simple, can it? Now, he was regretting not asking to speak to the boy alone. He was already almost sure that it would be Lindbergh. It was obvious, after all, Osepton had told him that calamities would follow wherever he went. Sasha, incredibly pale, turned to look at her boss in terror. We have to warn the church. I agree with the gorilla, princess. Flora interjected with a lost look, confused and somewhat tired. This is something they have to know and deal with. Not us. No one will say anything to the church, Adrian growled as he held his brow. Nothing. Sasha cried incredulously. They couldn't just keep this quiet. Come on, princess, I'm waiting for a good explanation. Flora entered with a frown. Adrian sighed loudly and shook his head. Lowering his hand, he looked seriously at his group. It's not that we're going to keep this information quiet. It's just that we can't reveal what Ademisal has just said. We have to ensure that revealing it won't provoke any reactions. Having a lot of experience, Flora understood what her companion was trying to say. A shiver ran through her body, and she immediately asked. Could revealing this make them know that we are aware of it? That's right. But wouldn't that mean what Ademisal revealed has already come to their attention? Jerry entered the conversation with a murmur. We're fine. The blessings of the Scarlet Monarch hid us, everything revealed in this room is hidden. Adrian lied without any shame. Of course, he was referring to Hunter's Hallow hiding them, but that would only be while they were close to him. Once they were far away, they could attract attention. That was a problem that had to be dealt with now. But those blessings are only present in this room. The levels involved are much greater than I thought, so, he won't be able to protect us forever. My lord is still recovering. He is not in a state to protect us all 24 hours a day, every day. Now, I will put you in a queue so you do not think about our conversation. It is not true hypnosis. It will just stop you thinking about it. Feeling an itch, Flora quickly asked, will you also hypnotize yourself? Adrian smiled slightly, my state is different to yours. I can control what I think to a certain extent, so it's not necessary. Besides, I have some special blessings that will allow me to carry this knowledge until the day comes when we reveal it to the church. Flora paused momentarily, but it wasn't long before she asked again, and when would that be? October 14th. Falling silent once more, the Jacob said nothing for 15 seconds. Then, she said with a bitter voice, her expression a mixture of disgust and rebuke, it hasn't even been a month, and you're doing it again. You're taking everything on your own again. It'll only be for a month. I can handle it. Rolling his shoulders a little, the redhead closed his eyes calmly. Then he laughed wearily. Besides, if I don't do it, who will? Quote. For a long 30 seconds, no one said anything. Sasha's clenched fists relaxed a little as she fell into thought. Meanwhile, Jerry and Ademisal looked at the redhead with shining eyes. Both share the same thought. How cool. Opera squeezed her heart and looked worriedly at the man who had just dismissed everything with a disinterested twist of his hands. If you're so worried about me, then concentrate on digesting your potions and advancing your sequences. Only by being stronger will you have the right to walk by my side. When I advance to sequence 5, I will also be able to control my thoughts to a certain extent. Once that happens, forget about carrying everything on your back by yourself. Flora looked at him sideways, her eyes unusually cold. Observing this, the redhead laughed. Ha! Of course. Don't think I won't charge interest once that happens. I'll do my best, boss. I'm not far from digesting my potion. Sasha nodded with her eyes shining determinedly. Mr. Kenway. My spectator potion was digested as soon as I took it. The same thing happened with Mr. Ademisal's. Couldn't we request the potion for the next sequence? Taking advantage of the fact that the subject was being discussed, Jerry finally asked the question she had wanted to ask as soon as she became a Beander. Ademisal looked at the girl next to him and quickly nodded in agreement. First of all, Adrian began seriously. You've only been a Beander for 2 weeks, and the boy has just become one. Although you have already digested the potion, and I can give you the sequence 8 potion right now, you must wait a little longer. How much longer, Mr. Kenway? And what are sequences and potions? What does digest mean? Ademisal joined the conversation, quickly expressing his doubts at the strange terms he was hearing. There it is. Pointing to the monster boy, Adrian continued, he doesn't even understand what potions are, and he already wants to advance. What's the point of that? Shaking his head, the redhead scratched his forehead and looked seriously at the two of them. If you want to advance now, you must do something for me first. Anything. Ademisal didn't take a second to agree. The murmurs said that he would be safe with the man in front of him and that he had to stay close no matter what. Even now, something inside him seemed to react to being alone in his presence. And from the new information in his head, that meant safety. Tell me, and I'll do it. Jerry was only a second slower. It will be something really basic. With the corners of his lips raised, he pressed his cheek against his knuckles. Sasha, this is also going to be for you. Taken somewhat by surprise, the giant looked at her boss in a daze. Sasha, Jerry, I want you to accompany Ademisal to the gaudy circus where Miss Furs works. Blinking in confusion, the brown-haired and blonde duo looked at their boss without understanding. If I might ask. Opera looked at everyone present. Why would they have to do that? To tempt fate, of course. Laughing a little, Adrian looked mischievously at everyone, his smile growing at the evident confusion. You don't have to worry about telling Furs, I'll take care of that. Without explaining himself, he closed his eyes. Sasha and Opera could hardly contain the urge to hit themselves in the face while Jerry hit her forehead with her palm. Ademisal, for his part, was happy that he could see the inside of a circus, just losing himself in his thoughts before the provocation. After his short joke, Adrian took the time to explain his path and what potions were to Ademisal and taught him how to enter cogitation, while Sasha explained the acting method. Shortly after that, with Sasha and Jerry's missions delivered and their roles once he had his fun, they all returned to their respective homes. The giant was in charge of the little one, so they went together. With his Harvey Wayne appearance back, the young businessman returned to his apartment with his guard. Leaning back in his beach chair on the outskirts of the City of Calamities, Adrian allowed himself to think about what Ademisal had revealed. He was a half-monster when he had that revelation, so it doesn't make sense that he had such a clear one. While he was able to whine a little about the problem with the rapper's child, that was merely a vision. Not a complete revelation. That someone who was not a complete monster received such a clear revelation could only mean two things. 1. The danger posed by the event was such that his intuition was so crazy that there was no other option but to give a clear vision. 2. The revelation received had not come directly from him, but had been an external influence. Not only was Ademisal in a city miles away from the point of revelation, but those events had almost nothing to do with him. Not only is Ins Zangwil here but also the demonist sect. With me here, there will inevitably be disaster on such a chaotic dance floor. The destruction he saw is undoubtedly a representation of the success of what the witches seek to achieve here. But why would he receive that revelation? With how far away the boy was from the event, the second option was undoubtedly the closest to the truth. Will Osepton was off the table. If the boy had seen such danger, he would have fled without hesitation, leaving only the mention in a dream and without saying more. No, it had to be someone else. Comparing the information he had about who could influence such a reaction, one subject came to mind. The redhead frowned towards the horizon. Ouroboros. One of the 9 kings of angels under the ancient sun god, angel of fate. There might be some other high-sequence monster, but that name resonated in his mind. The fanatic wouldn't act just like that, not without his daddy's permission, so the rapper was the one who sent that revelation through him. Maybe he wants me to deal with the Lindbergh witches. Tap. Tap. This being a new future and having achieved their objective, the Aurora Order would have no reason to ally itself with the demonist sect. Therefore, if the demonist sect wanted to achieve something on the scale of what a Demisol had seen, they would have to look for support elsewhere. Adrian knew one of those supports was Ins Zangwil, with 008 in his possession. Any script they had in mind could become reality. But one artifact alone, even one made with author's characteristics, would not be enough to do what they wanted on their own. More support was needed. Adrian's question now was, who? If someone like the rapper was willing to blow the whistle to warn him, it must be one of the other evil organizations. But the question would be, which one of them? Although there were many more questions than answers, at least he had a timeline. A Demisol said that a party was being held in the streets, and it was snowing. So, whatever the demonist sect had planned would happen between November and March, during the winter. I need to investigate more. Mumbling a little, he sighed tiredly and decided to put the matter on his to-do list. Now that a Demisol is attending the circus, the possibility of a destined encounter increases enormously. Now, it's just a question of when it will happen. If I use the brat's luck as an example, maybe a month or a month and a half. While thinking this, Adrian reached out his hand toward a corner. 2 objects flew from among the yellowish smoke until they landed before him. The reason he had kindly asked the writer to participate in a circus was not only for her to digest his potion, but also for her to initiate contact with the Abraham family in Ashera. Before leaving Backland for Lindbergh, Adrian had visited a house south of the bridge on 32nd Street on Verdi Street. The reason was to find out the house's owner's state and pick up a particular book. The reason he did it was simple. The owner of this house was an Abraham. An idiot who tried to advance apprentice in the middle of the blood moon and became the master key in the original story. When he found the key and the man's diary in the basement, he wasn't too surprised. Adrian was sure that a large number of the members of the Abraham family who were in Backland died during the first minutes of the moonless night. Honestly, he didn't worry about it much. He just bowed slightly, and after taking the key and the guy's diary, he left the place. As he remembered, the diary had the formulas for apprentice, trickmaster, and astrologer. So, the formulas for furs are solved for a bit, but he will need to contact the Abrahams to obtain the rest. Initially, he planned to spend some of his contribution points at the Tarot Club to ask Klein to use the book as a medium to search for the family members in Lindbergh using some excuse to explain it. But once he got the book on mirror divination, that changed. He could divine himself and avoid attracting Klein's attention. However, the results were mediocre at best. Since none of these objects meet the requirements for mirror divination, Adrian could only use the key's weak connection to work. But he didn't learn much. All he discovered was that the members of the Abraham family lived in the east of the country. They must have an artifact that interferes with divination. Since I don't have anything with a special connection, this is as far as I will get with what I have. Adrian was a little disappointed by this, but he wasn't depressed. If divination failed, there were always the Beander laws, precisely the third one. Whatever separates will definitely converge, and whatever converges will definitely separate. Although it was weak, low-sequence Beyonders were also affected by this. A family member would eventually be drawn there as long as furs performed in a high-traffic area and attracted decent attention. Of course, this was a time-consuming method and one that relied heavily on luck to even be successful. Luckily for Furs, a lucky freak entered their lives. With the boy's luck, the destined encounter will be hastened. When an Abraham enters the circus and sees Furs' acts, he will undoubtedly recognize them as a trickmaster. And with Jerry watching, anyone with an abnormality will be detected and Sasha will take care of following them. Once she gets a general area, Miss Sharon will take over and when there's an opportunity, she'll get me a hair. Once that happens, escape will be impossible, and I will be able to arrange a chance encounter between the two of them. Faced with such a scenario, Adrian couldn't help but let out a dark laugh. Shaking his head and deciding that he had already thought of everything he wanted to, he left the City of Calamities. He still had one more mission later on, so he had to save his strength. Backland. In a particular rented room in the borders of Empress Borough. Hazel Match was wearing her dark hunting clothes and boots. Her face was painted in dark colors, and her hair was tied in a low ponytail. In a few minutes, she would begin her infiltration mission, and it was time to prepare to ensure its success and seize the opportunity to act. Taking short breaths to calm her heart, she opened the briefcase she had brought and began to take out various ingredients to ask for the Scarlet Monarch's blessing. Sighing a little, the woman went to the corner of the room where a simple full-length mirror stood once she had finished taking out everything she needed. Grabbing a short dagger from her belt, she quickly made a wall of spirituality and then cut her forearm, making sure to avoid important points but drawing enough blood. Frowning a little at the pain, she grabbed the paper her boss had sent her and began to copy the symbols on the edges of the mirror with her blood while praying in ancient Hermes. The Scarlet Monarch who burns depravity, the calamity forgotten by time, the stranger who comes from the unknown. Your faithful servant prays for your attention. I pray for you to open the doors to your kingdom. I pray that you share my mind with the soldier Ignir and grant me a better ability to hide myself. As soon as she had said the last line, Hazel drew the symbol of the Scarlet Monarch with her blood, the spear covered by infinity and the open book. The multiple lines of the bloody symbols began to weep, heading towards the center in a vortex that began to expel yellowish smoke. The surface of the mirror trembled like an uneasy river. After a few seconds, the surface calmed down and showed a majestic city covered in yellowish smoke. Above the city, a figure in armor rose higher than it. In respect, Hazel stood up straight and saluted the figure. From the mirror, the smoke from the city began to seep out, but this smoke was a dark, bloody color. This smoke covered Hazel and quickly entered her body. Her clothes, which had already been prepared to move in the dark, seemed to become the darkness itself. Hazel felt like the shadows were embracing, hiding, and protecting her simultaneously. She felt she could trust them to take a powerful blow and emerge almost unscathed. Her wound was gone, not a single scar on her skin. It was as if she had never been cut. This is the blessing of a god. Controlling her thoughts, she straightened up even more and praised. Praise the monarch. Her voice was no longer hers but a cacophony of people whose gender could not be defined. Although she was still a believer in the Evernight goddess, her faith was not very strong, so praising another god did not bother her, just as she was not bothered by praying to him. Although their first meeting had been worse than horrible. That resulted from her arrogance and lack of trust in her teacher. She would not make such a mistake again. The monarch, who stood over the city, gave a slight nod. The smile she could see under his hood disappeared along with the city when the mirror returned to normal. Can you hear me? A voice sounded in her head, but Hazel wasn't scared. The voice was familiar. Loud and clear. Responding in her thoughts, Hazel couldn't help but find herself surprised again. It was as if Soldier Ignir was inside her head or at her side. This will only last about 30 minutes, so we must focus on being quick, Ignir said. The guards are concentrating more and more on the party, an opportunity will soon appear. As soon as the madam finds a window, we will act. I'm on my way. Thinking the words, Hazel put away everything she had used and hid it. Once she had done all that, she put on the burnt band. She was grateful to notice how the murmurs were much weaker than before. Vecchio Pomodoro. She put hangover time in a pocket and before leaving, she made sure that the mirror on her waist was securely fastened. With everything ready, the shadows enveloped her, and she disappeared from the room. Operation Catch the Rat had begun. Above the City of Calamities. Releasing his Scarlet Monarch disguise, Adrian Kenway sighed as he looked at himself. Combining the spirit body with a card of blasphemy caused one to obtain certain powers of the path that the card belonged to, along with the corresponding attire. For example, when Klein combined his spirit body with the Black Emperor's card of blasphemy, he obtained black armor, a crown of the same color, and a cape. He also gained some powers of the path. By combining his spirit body with the Hanged Man's card of blasphemy, Adrian gained some blood magic spells and control of the shadows, almost comparable to a shepherd. While the advantages of using the Hanged Man's card of blasphemy are great and all. This is. Pressing his lips together slightly, he looked at himself in embarrassment. He was completely naked. He was only wearing a skirt that barely reached above his knees and was open at the sides, with every step showing off his thick, pale legs. His ankles, wrists, and neck had thick steel shackles. Several chains were attached to these, some dragged along the ground while others wrapped around his body or floated tetrically but saintly around him. To innocent eyes, he looked like a saint who had been sacrificed. But in his own eyes, Adrian could think of only one thing. This is a full BDSM suit. What the hell was that old pervert thinking when he designed it? He looked like a sex slave. Shaking his head, he struck a few semi-provocative poses and nodded with some pride. Sex slave or not, I look fabulous. If he could wear this outside the City of Calamities, at least for a few minutes, the first thing he would do would undoubtedly be to go to his favorite worm. I bet she'd faint if she saw me like this. Laughing a little, the redhead separated himself from the card of blasphemy and held it in his left hand, his modesty returning with his pants and shirt. Unfortunately, I doubt it's a good idea. Due to the state of his soul, the combination fusion with the card could only be performed in the City of Calamities, where it was more stable and any outside influence was repelled. Adrian didn't want to test what would happen if he were to do it outside of it. Without its protection, it was almost certain that the mother of all consorts would assail his mind. Sure, I can always buy the shackles and chains and dress up. Oh, an idea quickly formed in his mind. Adding another thing to do to his already ridiculously long list, Adrian returned his attention to the current issue. The redhead summoned his beach chair and sat down, the blasphemy card on his lap ready to be absorbed. Since it was a dangerous mission, he had to watch out for accidents. His spy screen manifested on his forearm along with a mirror at his side, one showing a party of nobles and the other showing how his student quickly made her way there. After advancing to conspirator and completely digesting the potion, the time he could maintain the screen had increased considerably, so this would not be a very heavy burden for him. Forsaken land of the gods, city of silver. With a pile of books in his arms and his shapeshifter staff strapped to his waist, Derek strolled through the library with a bright smile, occasionally humming a song that came to him at the moment. Unable to help himself, his eyes occasionally returned to the sealed artifact at his waist, and his smile grew even wider. The artifact's abilities, while relatively simple, were so enhanced that it didn't matter. The training mannequins that every house in the Silver City has, each made from the monsters hunted in the dark outskirts of the walls that protected the city, were highly resistant. These were used as training in schools to teach the little ones how to defend themselves and how to deal with the monsters they would face once they were old enough. Before, a cut from his sword would hurt them, but the cuts weren't very deep. They barely grazed the beast's bones. Now, with the shapeshifter staff, a simple blow from his sword would cut them in half. He had never cut anything so easily. This was the case with each of the 5 weapons it could be converted into. The broadsword was a destroyer, pulverizing anything it hit. The arrows from the bow could cleanly pierce 5 mannequins. The spear was perfect for keeping one's distance, and its precise thrusts left holes the size of a child's head. The twin daggers made him ridiculously fast and deadly at close range, their only disadvantage being that very short range. This artifact is much more valuable than the formula and main ingredient of Dr. Derek knew the value of such a weapon but could not understand why the chariot would ask for so little in return. He knew that this, in a way, broke the fool's rule of equivalent exchange. And although Chariot himself had decided this, the boy couldn't help feeling horrible. That was why he had decided to come to the library. He had noticed that Chariot was really interested in the history of the city. And in its myths and legends. Although he had already given that knowledge to the man when he exchanged it for the bard's formula, he felt he had fallen short. By the time he handed over the payment, he hadn't read all the ancient books or the creation myths. He planned to read them now, if Chariot ever needed them. He could give him the information. Derek just hoped it would be enough. Shaking his head, the 14-year-old returned to the shelves. He went to one in particular that he wanted to read. The closer he got, the slower his steps became. A soft voice could be heard in the distance, that of a woman. She seemed to be talking to herself in whispers, but he could tell that she seemed to be having a conversation. This is one of the safest points in the city. But even so, I cannot let my guard down. Although the darkness inside the city was always controlled, it only took one mistake for an area to fall into darkness and monsters to appear. Shortening his steps and making himself as silent as he could, Derek began to approach the source of the murmurs. His hand on the shapeshifter staff, ready to draw it as soon as there was a problem. If he couldn't deal with the danger, he could always use the artifact's enhanced physical abilities to escape. As he moved, Derek realized that the murmurs were coming from the area he wanted to go to. This made him raise his guard. But when he was a few steps away, the murmurs stopped. Instead of feeling calmer, this alerted the young man even more. As soon as he reached the source of the murmurs, his guard went down as did his posture. A familiar woman was reading the book of the creation myth. She wore a long black robe embroidered with mysterious purple patterns. Her silvery gray hair was thick but curled up slightly. Her face was smooth and fair, and her appearance was gorgeous. She looked to be in her early 30s, and her pair of light gray eyes seemed to be able to pierce through one's soul. One of the members of the Council of Six, Shepherd Levia. Placing his hand on his chest and lowering his head slightly, he bowed respectfully. Greetings, Elder Levia. At being called, the woman looked up and, after looking at him for a moment, gave a slight nod in acknowledgement. Her pale gray eyes were focused and calm. The boy's eyes went to the old book in the woman's hands for a moment before returning up. Easily noticing this, she closed the book and held it out to him. You can take it. I've finished reading it. Thank you, Elder Levia. Somewhat taken aback, Derek quickly recovered and took the book from her hands. The woman's slightly gray eyes calmly rested on him. It is good for young children to review the creation myths. That way, we can appreciate the miracles performed by the Lord who created all and praise His grace and love. With those few words, Elder Levia left the space between the bookshelves. Derek was a little surprised by this. Although she's still doing strange things, suddenly becoming sad, happy, growling angrily, the episodes are further apart. Elder Levia seems to be returning to normal. As soon as he thought that, the boy couldn't help but sigh happily. That's good. With Elder Levia's improved mental state, expeditions will be much safer. Shaking his head slightly, the boy looked at the old book in his hand and placed it with the rest.